Imagine a land of breathtaking natural contrasts, where the driest desert in the world stretches endlessly to the north, glaciers and icy peaks dominate the south, and in between, fertile valleys and forests tell the story of a country shaped by extremes. This is Chile, a nation that seems to have been designed to inspire awe. The Atacama Desert's harsh landscapes, the snow-capped Andes towering over cities like Santiago, and the calm yet powerful waters of the Pacific Ocean shaping life along the coast. Yet beneath this natural splendor, Chile in the 1960s was a country deeply divided, a society on the edge of profound change, with inequalities, tensions, and aspirations simmering in every corner of life. The contrast between wealth and poverty in Chile was stark. In the cities, Santiago's skyline hinted at modernity in progress. Concrete buildings, new factories, and bustling streets were symbols of industrial and economic development. Cafes, bookstores, and theaters attracted the middle and upper classes, offering a glimpse of cosmopolitan life. Yet mere blocks away, entire neighborhoods, called poblaciones by the locals, housed families in small, fragile homes built of wood or adobe. These communities often lack basic amenities such as clean water, electricity, or adequate health care. Children played in the dusty streets, and women juggled work, household chores, and the struggle to feed their families. In the rural areas, life was equally challenging, but shaped by centuries of inequality and rigid social structures. Farmers worked tirelessly on land that they often did not own. Generations of labor had produced crops, cattle, and wealth, yet the fruits of their labor enriched large landowners rather than the workers themselves. Many families lived in extreme poverty, their lives dictated by cycles of labor and subsistence. The rich, urban elites, industrialists, and wealthy landowners enjoyed comfort, education, and political influence, while the majority of Chileans faced hunger, illness, and limited opportunities. These inequalities were not abstract statistics, they were lived experiences. A family in the northern copper mining town of Chuquicamata might endure harsh working conditions underground for minimal wages, while children in Santiago went to school with crumbling supplies. Families in the southern countryside might toil on lands controlled by absentee landlords, dreaming of the day they could claim a plot of land as their own. These contrasts created a profound awareness among Chileans. The country's wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, while millions struggled to survive. By the 1960s, Chileans were beginning to ask questions that could no longer be ignored. Why were some people so wealthy, while others struggled for basic necessities? Why were farmers denied ownership of the lands they had worked for generations? Why did children in urban neighborhoods go hungry while others attended schools equipped with libraries and laboratories? These questions were not simply academic, they were urgent, emotional, and deeply personal. They fueled discussions in homes, markets, workplaces, and universities, sparking a social awakening. Students in Santiago, Valparaíso, and Concepción formed groups to discuss political reforms and social justice. Workers organized unions and strikes, demanding better wages and working conditions. Farmers began to speak openly about land reform, inspired by the idea that justice could be achieved through collective action. Intellectuals, artists, and writers used their work to highlight societal inequalities, with novels, murals, and plays depicting the lives of ordinary Chileans. Newspapers, radio programs, and public gatherings became platforms for debate, reflection, and activism. This era was not just a political awakening, it was a cultural and social revolution. Ordinary citizens began to see themselves not as passive observers of inequality, but as participants in shaping the nation's future. The desire for change permeated every level of society, creating a sense of possibility and hope. Chile's political scene in the 1960s was complex, fragmented, and vibrant. Multiple parties competed for influence, representing a wide spectrum of ideologies. Conservatives sought to maintain traditional structures of power, advocating for the protection of private property and the interests of business elites. Socialists, communists, and progressive parties pushed for reforms, emphasizing social justice, education, healthcare, and land redistribution. The Christian Democrats, a centrist party, attempted to balance economic development with social responsibility, appealing to moderate citizens. Political debate was not confined to elite circles. Ordinary citizens engaged actively, attending rallies, reading political newspapers, and discussing policy at the workplace or in local cafes. Students and teachers debated educational reform, workers debated labor laws, and farmers debated land ownership. These discussions were intense and passionate, reflecting the stakes involved, the future of Chile's democracy, its economy, and the well-being of millions. Among those who emerged as a prominent figure of hope and reform was Salvador Allende. A doctor by training and a politician by calling, Allende dedicated his life to advocating for the rights of workers, farmers, and ordinary citizens. He believed that Chile could become a fairer society if the government prioritized the needs of the many over the privileges of the elite. His vision encompassed education for all children, healthcare for all citizens, and land reforms that would break centuries of inequity. To supporters, Allende represented hope, a leader who could bridge the gap between aspiration and reality. Chile's economy in the 1960s was heavily dependent on copper, which accounted for the majority of the nation's export revenue. Copper mining generated immense wealth, but the profits flowed predominantly to foreign companies and domestic elites, leaving workers with minimal compensation. Conditions in the mines were harsh. Workers faced long hours underground, exposure to hazardous materials, and little access to health care. Strikes were frequent, but industrialists and authorities often responded with suppression rather than negotiation. Outside the mining towns, farmers faced their own economic challenges. Land distribution was deeply unequal, with a small number of landowners controlling vast estates. Farmers struggled to secure fair prices for their crops and were often indebted to local merchants. Poverty in rural areas was widespread, with limited access to health care, education, and infrastructure. Children frequently went hungry, and women bore the double burden of labor and domestic care. Urban Chile was not immune to these challenges. Rapid urbanization created overcrowded neighborhoods, insufficient housing, and inadequate public services. Transportation was limited, sanitation was poor, and crime rates rose in the absence of strong social support. These conditions contributed to frustration and growing unrest among city dwellers, further fueling the desire for political change. Education became a central battleground for reform. Students demanded access to quality schools and universities, arguing that knowledge should not be a privilege of the wealthy. They organized protests, strikes, and awareness campaigns, sometimes clashing with authorities, but gaining public support for their cause. Teachers and intellectuals played a crucial role, advocating for curriculum reform, teacher training, and expansion of educational facilities. Workers also mobilized. Strikes, marches, and union activities became increasingly common as laborers demanded fair wages, safer working conditions, and the right to organize. Farmers in rural communities pressed for land reform, arguing that the redistribution of land was not only fair but essential for national development. These movements reflected the broader societal debate. Was Chile willing to embrace change, or would entrenched powers maintain the status quo? The media, too, played a pivotal role. Newspapers and radio programs became platforms for debate, criticism, and information dissemination. Journalists highlighted stories of inequality, workers' struggles, and grassroots activism, shaping public opinion and amplifying calls for reform. Meanwhile, political leaders used speeches, pamphlets and rallies to communicate their visions, sometimes clashing with media narratives, creating a dynamic, often volatile political climate. Salvador Allende's increasing popularity was not accidental. His decades-long engagement with political struggles, his advocacy for workers and farmers, and his unyielding commitment to social justice resonated with ordinary Chileans. He offered a vision of Chile where education, healthcare, and land reform could transform society, breaking the chains of centuries-old inequality. Yet Allende's rise also sparked fear among the wealthy and powerful. Business elites, landowners, and conservative politicians worried that redistributing wealth and nationalizing industries would undermine their influence and economic dominance. They began strategizing ways to resist, forming alliances and seeking international support. The United States, concerned about the spread of socialist policies in Latin America during the Cold War, closely monitored the situation, adding another layer of tension to an already fragile political landscape. By the late 1960s, Chile stood at a crossroads. The challenges were immense, the opposition formidable, and the path ahead uncertain. Yet the courage, ambition, and hope of its people would plant the seeds for the transformations to come. This chapter marks the beginning of a journey toward reform, resistance, and ultimately profound change that would reshape Chile for generations. The story of Chile in the 1960s is a story of contrasts, breathtaking landscapes alongside social deprivation, wealth and power alongside poverty and struggle, hope and fear intertwined in the hearts of ordinary Chileans. It is a story of awakening, of a society beginning to demand justice, equality, and opportunity. And it is a story of leaders like Salvador Allende, who emerged from the political arena as symbols of possibility, offering a vision that could change the course of a nation. Chile was on the edge of history. The challenges were immense, the opposition formidable, and the path ahead uncertain. Yet the courage, ambition, and hope of its people would plant the seeds for the transformations to come. This chapter marks the beginning of a journey toward reform, resistance, and ultimately profound change that would reshape Chile for generations. In the early 1970s, Chile was a nation simmering with hope, tension, and expectation. Ordinary citizens, farmers in the southern valleys, miners in the northern deserts, workers in Santiago's bustling streets, and students in the universities were longing for leadership that could speak to their struggles and turn their dreams into reality. Into this landscape stepped Salvador Allende, a man whose political life had been defined by persistence, principle, and the pursuit of social justice. Allende's journey was neither sudden nor accidental. Born in 1908 into a modest middle-class family in Valparaiso, he grew up witnessing inequality firsthand. His father, a physician, instilled in him the value of education, compassion, and service to society. Young Allende, curious and observant, quickly recognized the disparities around him. While some families lived comfortably, countless others struggled to secure even the most basic necessities. These early experiences shaped the moral compass that would guide him for the rest of his life. By the 1930s, Allende had earned a medical degree, but he found the practice of medicine insufficient to address the systemic injustices he observed. Treating individual patients could ease suffering temporarily, but it did not challenge the structures that perpetuated inequality. He realized that meaningful change required engagement in politics, law, and society itself. With this understanding, Allende joined the Socialist Party of Chile, beginning a lifelong commitment to progressive politics, labor rights, and public service. Allende's early political career was marked by dedication and resilience. He campaigned tirelessly for workers' rights, advocating for fair wages, safe working conditions, and the right to organize unions. He visited mining towns, rural communities, and industrial neighborhoods, listening to the grievances of ordinary citizens. His empathetic approach earned him the trust of those who had long felt ignored by politicians. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Allende did not speak from the comfort of privileged offices. He immersed himself in the lived experiences of Chileans, making their struggles central to his political vision. By the 1960s, Allende had emerged as a seasoned political figure, running multiple campaigns for office and holding positions in the Chilean legislature. He became renowned not only for his commitment to social justice, but also for his unwavering honesty. In a country where political corruption often went unchecked, Allende's integrity distinguished him from other politicians. He argued that public office was a responsibility to the people, not a vehicle for personal gain. This ethical stance, combined with his dedication to reform, earned him broad support among workers, intellectuals, students, and even some middle-class citizens seeking a fairer society. Chile, at this time, was a nation on the edge of transformation. The economy, heavily reliant on copper, had produced wealth, but the majority of citizens remained impoverished. Social programs were limited, and inequalities in education, healthcare, and land ownership were stark. Farmers worked lands they did not own. Industrial workers endured unsafe conditions, and students faced barriers to higher education. Allende's message resonated deeply. He promised a Chile where resources would benefit all citizens, not just the privileged few. Allende's vision extended beyond economic reform. He spoke passionately about land redistribution, believing that peasants should have control over the land they cultivated. This policy was not merely an economic measure, it was a moral imperative. Ownership of land represented dignity, independence, and hope. For generations, Chilean farmers had been tied to estates controlled by wealthy landowners. Allende envisioned a future in which these families could finally claim their rightful place as proprietors of their own labor. Education was another cornerstone of Allende's philosophy. He argued that knowledge should not be a luxury for the rich, but a right for every child. Schools and universities needed expansion. Teacher training had to improve, and curricula should prepare students for meaningful participation in society. Healthcare, similarly, was a public right. Allende believed that no Chilean should suffer or die because of inadequate access to medical services. Clinics, vaccination campaigns, and hospitals were essential to building a healthier and more equitable society. Despite his popularity among ordinary citizens, Allende faced formidable opposition. Wealthy landowners, industrialists, and conservative politicians viewed his proposals as threats to their power and economic interests. They feared that land reform, nationalization of industries, and social welfare programs would undermine their dominance. Their resistance was both political and economic, leveraging media, lobbying, and alliances to counter Allende's growing influence. Internationally, the United States watched with concern. In the context of the Cold War, American policymakers feared the rise of a socialist government in Latin America, perceiving it as a potential threat to U.S. interests and regional stability. Covert operations, funding of opposition groups, and diplomatic pressure were already being considered. Allende's campaign for the presidency in 1970 was historic. He ran on a platform emphasizing democracy, equality, and social justice, appealing directly to Chileans who had long felt marginalized. His message resonated particularly with workers, students, and rural communities. Campaign rallies drew tens of thousands, filled with chants of hope and determination. Farmers envisioned ownership of land, workers imagined fair wages and safe conditions, and students dreamed of a future where education could truly empower them. Allende became not just a candidate, but a symbol of possibility, the embodiment of Chilean hopes for a more just society. The election was tense and closely contested. Chileans from all walks of life engaged actively in the democratic process, understanding that the stakes were enormous. When the results were announced, Salvador Allende had narrowly won the presidency, becoming the first Marxist leader elected democratically in Latin America. His victory was historic, signaling the potential for a nation to embrace reform through the ballot box, rather than violence. For millions, it was a moment of hope, a chance to witness their dreams begin to take shape in policy, governance, and society. Allende's presidency marked a beginning of an ambitious and transformative era in Chilean history. From the very first day in office, he faced immense challenges, balancing reformist ambitions with political opposition, economic constraints, and international scrutiny. Yet, he remained resolute, guided by the principles that had shaped his life: justice, equity, and democracy. Allende's first initiatives were the nationalization of copper mines, the backbone of Chile's economy. Foreign corporations had long dominated this sector, extracting wealth from the country while leaving ordinary Chileans with minimal benefit. Allende's government sought to redirect profits to public programs, investing in healthcare, education, and infrastructure for the broader population. This decision, though popular among workers and citizens, alarmed foreign investors and conservative elites, setting the stage for political and economic conflict. Land reform was another priority. Under Allende's leadership, large estates were divided and redistributed among peasants and rural workers. Families who had labored for generations finally gained ownership of the land they cultivated. This policy was transformative, offering not only economic security but also social dignity and political empowerment. Land reform also faced fierce opposition. Wealthy landowners resisted, often with the support of conservative political factions, creating tension and at times violent confrontations in the countryside. Education reform was equally ambitious. Schools were built or expanded, teacher training programs were enhanced, and curricula were revised to emphasize practical skills alongside traditional learning. Education became a tool for social mobility, enabling children from marginalized backgrounds to imagine futures beyond the limitations imposed by poverty. Higher education, previously accessible primarily to the affluent, began to open its doors to students from all social classes. Universities became spaces for debate, innovation, and social engagement, fostering a generation of young Chileans committed to progress and equality. Healthcare initiatives were launched simultaneously. Clinics, hospitals, and vaccination campaigns reached communities that had never seen a doctor. Rural areas, previously neglected, received mobile health services, ensuring that children, the elderly, and vulnerable populations had access to essential medical care. These reforms were not abstract. They transformed daily life, offering tangible improvements in nutrition, health, and well-being. However, Allende's vision was without significant challenges. Conservative politicians and business elites resisted reforms, using media campaigns, lobbying, and economic pressure to undermine his administration. Strikes, shortages, and protests became increasingly common, fueled in part by opposition strategies. International actors, especially the United States, engaged in covert operations aimed at destabilizing Chile's economy and eroding public support for Allende. Inflation rose, supply chains were disrupted, and citizens experienced uncertainty about the availability of everyday goods. Despite these obstacles, Allende remained steadfast. He addressed the nation directly, communicating the rationale behind reforms and urging patience. He reminded citizens that meaningful change required collective effort and resilience, acknowledging the difficulties while emphasizing the long-term benefits. His leadership was characterized by transparency, empathy, and an unshakable commitment to democratic principles. Socially, Allende's reforms had profound effects. Farmers experienced newfound independence and dignity. Workers gained confidence and bargaining power. Students pursued education with renewed vigor. And ordinary citizens saw that government could serve the people, not merely the elite. Chile became a laboratory of progressive policy, demonstrating the potential for democracy to enact meaningful change. Yet, resistance continued to grow. Economic difficulties, political polarization, and external pressures created an environment of tension and uncertainty. Strikes, protests, and media campaigns amplified fears of instability. Within the government, disagreements arose over the pace and extent of reforms, reflecting the complexity of balancing revolutionary ambition with practical governance. Allende's presidency, however, was more than a series of policies. It was a vision of what Chile could become, a nation where justice, equality, and opportunity were accessible to all. His commitment inspired hope across social classes, empowering citizens to participate actively in shaping their society. Farmers, students, workers, and intellectuals felt that their country could achieve a level of fairness and dignity previously thought impossible. The rise of Allende and the implementation of his vision illustrate a fundamental lesson in leadership. Meaningful change requires courage, principle, and a willingness to face adversity. While challenges were immense, the Chilean people experienced a brief yet transformative period in which hope, reform, and social justice converged. This era laid the groundwork for future political struggles, societal debates, and ongoing conversations about democracy, equality, and the role of government in shaping the lives of its citizens. By the early 1970s, Chile, under Salvador Allende, was a country brimming with hope, yet increasingly fraught with tension. Allende's ambitious reforms, nationalizing industries, redistributing land, expanding healthcare, and reforming education, had inspired millions. Farmers, workers, students, and intellectuals saw in him the possibility of a Chile where equality and justice were not just ideals, but achievable realities. But hope often provokes fear. Allende's policies directly challenged entrenched power structures. Wealthy landowners, industrialists, and conservative politicians perceived him as a threat to their influence and economic interests. These groups had long dominated Chilean politics and society. They had controlled the wealth, the media, and the policy decisions that shaped the country. Allende's reforms threatened to redistribute not just resources, but power itself. The backlash was immediate. Strikes, demonstrations, and protests emerged across Chile. Some factory owners resisted government control, refusing to comply with new labor regulations. Farmers loyal to large landowners resisted redistribution efforts, and urban residents began experiencing shortages of essential goods. Food, fuel, and consumer products became increasingly difficult to obtain, creating frustration even among those who supported the reforms. Media outlets played a pivotal role in shaping public perception. Many newspapers, radio stations, and television channels were controlled or influenced by conservative interests. They painted Allende's government as reckless and chaotic, emphasizing shortages, protests, and alleged economic mismanagement. Headlines warned of Chile on the edge of disaster, framing reform as a threat rather than progress. Ordinary citizens consuming this information daily felt anxiety and fear, and divisions grew within communities. Political opposition was not limited to the right wing. Even among left-wing allies, disagreements arose about the pace and scope of reforms. Some parties and leaders argued for cautious implementation, fearing economic backlash or political instability. Others pushed for radical measures, believing that partial reform would fail to deliver justice. Allende had to navigate this complex political landscape, balancing the expectations of his supporters with the realities of governance. Chile became a country of stark contrasts. In the cities, students protested for greater educational reforms, workers demanded better wages, and intellectuals debated the future of Chilean democracy. In rural areas, farmers adjusted to newfound land ownership while confronting resistance from conservative neighbors. Social tensions escalated daily, and the sense of national cohesion began to fray. Citizens wondered whether Chile could maintain its democratic path amid such polarization. These internal pressures were amplified by the economic challenges facing the nation. Inflation rose steadily, partly due to the redistribution of resources and partly due to opposition-led disruptions in production and trade. Shortages of essential goods created queues, frustration, and even public unrest. For many Chileans, supporting Allende became a complicated act, balancing hope for reform with the practical challenges of daily survival. The stage was set for confrontation. Allende remained committed to his vision, addressing the nation with speeches emphasizing patience, unity, and resilience. He reminded citizens that meaningful change was never easy, and that temporary difficulties were part of the broader journey toward equality. Farmers continued to cultivate redistributed land with renewed purpose. Students organized campaigns for education and political awareness. Workers engaged in dialogues about labor rights. Yet the tension between hope and fear intensified, creating a volatile political climate. While opposition grew domestically, Allende's government faced external pressures that would prove decisive. The United States, alarmed by the rise of a Marxist leader in Latin America, closely monitored Chile. In the context of the Cold War, American policymakers perceived Allende not merely as a national leader, but as a potential catalyst for regional socialist movements. They feared that his democratic socialism could inspire similar governments in neighboring countries, undermining U.S. economic and political influence. The U.S. response was multifaceted, combining diplomacy, economic pressure, and covert operations. Intelligence agencies, including the CIA, actively sought to destabilize Chile's economy and weaken Allende's administration. They provided funding and support to opposition groups, encouraged strikes, and influenced media outlets to portray the government as incompetent and dangerous. These efforts aimed to create discontent among ordinary citizens, hoping that economic hardship and public frustration would erode Allende's popularity. Economic interference was particularly impactful. International loans and credits were restricted, limiting the government's ability to import essential goods. Foreign corporations resisted nationalization, withholding investment and production, contributing to shortages. Inflation accelerated, and ordinary Chileans felt the pinch in grocery stores, hospitals, and workplaces. Even citizens who supported Allende's vision experienced daily challenges that made them question the feasibility of reform. Covert operations extended beyond economics. The U.S. monitored Chile's military and political institutions, cultivating relationships with leaders who might oppose Allende. Plans for destabilization, regime change, or even a coup were discussed at high levels. While these actions were clandestine, their impact was felt in the growing instability across Chile. Labor unrest, civil demonstrations, and political polarization became part of everyday life. Amid this turmoil, Allende's leadership was tested in unprecedented ways. He continued to speak to the people, emphasizing transparency, democratic participation, and social justice. His messages often highlighted the resilience of ordinary Chileans, encouraging communities to work together despite the pressures around them. Yet the convergence of internal opposition and external interference created an environment in which progress became increasingly difficult. Social tensions grew sharper with each passing year. Students organized massive protests for educational and political reforms, often clashing with security forces or counter-protesters. Workers participated in strikes and sit-ins, demanding fair wages and recognition of labor rights. Farmers defended their newly acquired land, sometimes facing threats or sabotage from previous landowners. Cities became arenas of political struggle, where the hope of reform and the fear of instability collided daily. By the early 1970s, Chile was increasingly polarized. Ordinary citizens who once believed in democratic solutions began to experience disillusionment. Neighborhoods, workplaces, and universities were divided along ideological lines. Families debated politics around dinner tables. Workplaces were marked by tension, and community trust eroded. The social fabric, once held together by shared civic identity, began to fray under the weight of conflict. The combination of domestic resistance and U.S. covert operations brought Chile to a tipping point. Economic instability, political opposition, and foreign interference created conditions that were difficult to manage. Allende's government remained committed to reform, yet faced an uphill struggle against forces that sought to undermine it at every turn. The pressure was immense, testing both the resilience of the Chilean people and the determination of their leader. As 1973 approached, the nation stood on the edge of uncertainty. The dream of a socially just Chile, nurtured by Allende and embraced by millions, was under siege. Political divisions deepened, economic hardships intensified, and the looming threat of external interference grew. Citizens and leaders alike wondered whether democracy could survive in such a volatile environment. The stage was being set for a dramatic confrontation, one that would determine the future of Chile and shape its history for decades to come. Chile's story during this period is a testament to the fragility of democracy and the resilience of human hope. It illustrates how internal opposition and external pressures can converge to create a climate of tension, uncertainty, and conflict. The events of these years would test the courage, vision, and leadership of Salvador Allende while challenging ordinary citizens to navigate a rapidly changing and often perilous political landscape. By September 1973, Chile was a nation on edge. The streets of Santiago were alive with tension, anxiety, and uncertainty. Salvador Allende, the democratically elected president, remained steadfast in his vision for a socially just Chile, yet the pressures surrounding his government were immense. Years of political polarization, economic instability, and social unrest had frayed the nation's sense of cohesion. Even ordinary citizens felt the growing weight of fear and division. For many Chileans, the streets had become arenas of conflict. Strikes and protests were frequent, fueled by both genuine grievances and politically motivated campaigns. Food shortages and inflation created daily challenges for families, intensifying frustrations. Meanwhile, rural communities adjusted to Allende's land reform policies, often facing resistance from previous landowners or local elites who opposed change. Amidst this tension, Allende addressed the nation regularly, calling for unity, patience, and resilience. He reminded citizens that real change was never easy, and that Chile's path toward equality required collective effort and perseverance. His speeches emphasized democratic values and the power of ordinary people to shape the future. Yet behind the scenes, powerful forces were mobilizing. The Chilean military, traditionally seen as a stabilizing institution, grew increasingly concerned about Allende's reforms. High-ranking officers, including General Augusto Pinochet, believed that the government was steering the nation toward chaos and feared the consolidation of leftist power. Meetings, intelligence reports, and strategic planning among military leaders created an atmosphere of anticipation and unease. Foreign powers also played a significant role. The United States, concerned about the spread of socialism in Latin America, had conducted covert operations for years. Economic pressures, media campaigns, and secret meetings had weakened public trust in Allende's administration. As Chile approached September 1973, the convergence of domestic opposition and foreign interference created a precarious political environment, making a coup increasingly likely. Ordinary Chileans experienced the tension in their daily lives. Children walked to school amid political demonstrations, workers navigated streets crowded with protesters, and families discussed news reports filled with warnings of instability. Trust between neighbors was strained, as ideological differences often sparked heated debates. In this atmosphere, fear and uncertainty became a constant presence. Despite the looming threat, Allende remained resolute. He continued to speak directly to citizens, emphasizing democratic principles and the importance of unity. His calm, steady demeanor contrasted sharply with the uncertainty around him, earning him admiration and loyalty from supporters even as tensions escalated. Political analysts of the time noted the delicate balance Chile faced. The nation was caught between hope and fear, democracy and authoritarianism, reform and reaction. Each day brought new challenges, and the coming events would test the courage, leadership, and resilience of both the president and the Chilean people. The morning of September 11, 1973, arrived with an air of apprehension. Chileans awoke to unusual military movements. Tanks rolled through the streets of Santiago, troops were mobilized, and key government buildings were surrounded. Radio stations broadcast messages urging calm, yet the tension was palpable. Families huddled together, uncertain of what was unfolding and what the future held. Allende delivered his final address to the nation from the presidential palace, La Moneda. His voice was calm yet resolute, carrying a message of courage, dignity, and hope. He reminded Chileans that democracy, justice, and national unity were worth defending, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. His words, imbued with moral conviction, would later become legendary, a testament to his unwavering principles. As the coup unfolded, military forces quickly seized control of strategic points across the country. Communication centers, government offices, and transportation hubs were occupied. Soldiers enforced curfews and restricted movement, signaling the decisive nature of the operation. The speed and coordination of the military left citizens shocked and fearful as the nation's democratic framework appeared to collapse before their eyes. Inside La Moneda, Allende made a final stand. Aware that resistance could result in massive civilian casualties, he chose to remain in the palace, addressing supporters and staff with courage and dignity. Reports indicate that he refused offers of safe passage, insisting that his presence symbolized the principles he had fought for. Ultimately, he died inside the presidential palace, a figure of moral and political steadfastness whose legacy would endure beyond his life. With Allende's fall, General Augusto Pinochet quickly established control over the nation. The military dissolved Congress, banned political parties, and implemented strict censorship. Citizens faced curfews, surveillance, and widespread fear. The streets, once alive with public debate and activism, were silenced under the presence of tanks and armed soldiers. Pinochet's regime marked the beginning of a military dictatorship that would dominate Chile for nearly 2 decades. It was characterized by centralized authority, suppression of political opposition, and a focus on economic restructuring guided by free market principles. Thousands of individuals, political opponents, activists, students, and ordinary citizens were detained, exiled, or disappeared. Fear became an omnipresent reality as families questioned the safety of loved ones and communities learned to navigate life under authoritarian rule. The economic and social impact of the coup was profound. Industries nationalized by Allende were returned to private ownership, often benefiting elites and foreign corporations. Land redistributed to peasants was reclaimed by previous owners. Education and healthcare programs were rolled back or redirected, leaving millions without access to essential services. Chile's social landscape shifted dramatically, replacing ideals of equality with a focus on order, control, and market-driven policies. Cultural life was also deeply affected. Media censorship limited public discourse, banned books and films restricted expression, and citizens learned to self-censor to avoid persecution. Schools taught only what the regime deemed acceptable, while underground movements worked in secrecy to preserve knowledge, culture, and the memory of resistance. Artists, writers, and musicians conveyed subversive messages through coded works, sustaining hope and defiance in subtle yet impactful ways. Despite the oppressive environment, Chileans continued to resist. Families shared stories of Allende and the dreams of a just society. Underground networks organized education, labor support, and political awareness campaigns. Citizens maintained the memory of democratic values and envisioned a future where justice and equality could once again thrive. The international community responded with a mix of condemnation and pragmatism. Human rights organizations documented abuses, governments criticized the repression, and some nations imposed sanctions or restrictions. Others, prioritizing economic and political interests, maintained alliances with Pinochet's regime. Chile's story became a cautionary tale of the fragility of democracy, the concentration of power, and the resilience of ordinary citizens under authoritarian rule. Pinochet's seizure of power was more than a political event. It was a dramatic social upheaval. Chilean society was reshaped, freedoms were curtailed, and the dreams of Allende's generation were temporarily suppressed. Yet even in the darkest moments, the spirit of hope endured. Ordinary citizens, inspired by memories of Allende's vision, continued to fight for justice, preserving the ideals of democracy and equality for future generations. The 1973 coup demonstrated how quickly a nation's democratic framework could be dismantled when political polarization, economic instability, and foreign intervention converge. It highlighted the courage required to uphold principles in the face of overwhelming force and underscored the enduring importance of civic engagement, solidarity, and vigilance. Chile's journey through the coup and its immediate aftermath serves as both a warning and an inspiration. It shows how power can be seized, societies reshaped, and freedoms curtailed, but also how moral courage, resilience, and hope can survive even the harshest conditions. The story of Allende and Pinochet is a complex narrative of ideals and power, democracy and authoritarianism, hope and fear. A chapter that would leave a lasting imprint on Chilean society and global history. After September 11, 1973, Chile entered a new and ominous chapter in its history. The democratically elected government of Salvador Allende had fallen, and General Augusto Pinochet's military junta took control, bringing with it strict authoritarian rule. The streets of Santiago and other major cities were patrolled by tanks and armed soldiers. Curfews were imposed, public gatherings were prohibited, and political discussion became a dangerous activity. Citizens quickly realized that expressing dissent could result in arrest, torture, or disappearance. Fear became a constant companion in everyday life. Pinochet justified his actions as necessary to restore order and stability to a nation he claimed was on the brink of chaos. Many Chileans initially supported him, particularly those who had opposed Allende's reforms or feared a socialist consolidation of power. Yet even for those who welcomed the promise of stability, it became increasingly clear that this new order demanded strict conformity and absolute obedience. The freedom and democracy that Chileans had cherished were replaced by surveillance, control, and repression. Political opposition was systematically dismantled. Congress was dissolved, and political parties were banned. Leaders of leftist movements, activists, union organizers, and intellectuals were detained. The regime developed an extensive network of secret police and intelligence operations aimed at identifying, monitoring, and neutralizing perceived threats. Families lived in constant uncertainty, afraid for the safety of loved ones, while citizens learned to navigate a society where trust was scarce and suspicion was necessary for survival. The methods of repression were brutal. Reports of torture, forced exile, and extrajudicial killings became common. Thousands of individuals simply disappeared, leaving families with no closure or explanation. Communities that had once been vibrant centers of political discussion and cultural activity were silenced. Fear became an invisible yet omnipresent force, shaping behavior and social interactions. Education and public discourse were deeply affected. Schools and universities were placed under strict oversight. Curricula were redesigned to align with the regime's ideology, emphasizing loyalty, discipline, and order. Teachers and academics faced censorship, and students learned to self-censor to avoid punishment. Universities, which had been hubs of activism and intellectual debate, became controlled environments where questioning authority was discouraged or punished. Despite the oppressive environment, resistance persisted. Underground networks developed to protect citizens, provide education, and maintain political awareness. Secret publications, clandestine meetings, and covert communication channels allowed activists to continue their work, often at great personal risk. Artists, writers, and musicians used coded messages to express dissent, keeping hope alive and inspiring subtle forms of protest. The psychological impact of the dictatorship was profound. Generations of Chileans grew up in an environment where fear was normalized. Families lived with anxiety over political affiliation and expression, and communities were fractured by suspicion and surveillance. The trauma of the early years of repression would echo for decades, influencing cultural norms, social relations, and political engagement. The Pinochet regime also sought to control history and collective memory. Symbols of Allende's government were removed, public spaces were repurposed, and narratives glorifying the military and its role in saving Chile were promoted. Museums, media, and education were used as instruments to shape perception and consolidate power. Ordinary citizens, however, found ways to preserve memory, sharing stories and maintaining traditions that reflected their experiences before the coup. Chileans navigated a precarious balance between survival and moral responsibility. For many, daily life required compromises, outward compliance paired with private dissent. Citizens learned to read subtle signs of danger, to avoid political discussion in public, and to seek support from trusted networks. This climate fostered resilience, resourcefulness, and an enduring sense of hope, even under extreme repression. By 1975, the Pinochet regime had firmly established its control over Chilean society. Fear had become routine, opposition had been suppressed, and the mechanisms of authoritarian rule were firmly in place. Yet even in these conditions, the seeds of resistance persisted, maintained by those who remembered the democratic ideals of Allende's Chile and who refused to abandon the dream of justice, equality, and freedom. Pinochet's dictatorship brought sweeping economic and social changes, which reshaped Chile in ways that would have long-lasting consequences. Guided by a group of economists known as the Chicago Boys, the regime implemented free market policies, privatization, and reductions in state involvement in daily life. This economic model aimed to stabilize inflation, encourage investment, and promote growth, yet it often came at the cost of social welfare and equity. Industries nationalized under Allende, particularly copper mining, were returned to private ownership. Wealthy business interests and foreign corporations regained significant control over Chile's resources, creating an economic structure that favored elites while limiting opportunities for ordinary citizens. Land reforms introduced by Allende were rolled back, returning farms to previous owners or consolidating them under large corporate operations. Millions of peasants who had briefly experienced the dignity of land ownership were forced back into subservient labor, reinforcing the social hierarchy. Social programs, including education, healthcare, and housing initiatives, were scaled back or redirected. Access to schools, hospitals, and social services became limited for those outside the upper echelons of society. Inequality, which had been a central issue during Allende's presidency, widened further under Pinochet's policies. Families struggled with poverty and unemployment, while urban centers saw the emergence of slums and marginalized communities. Cultural life in Chile underwent profound transformation. Censorship became pervasive. Media outlets were tightly controlled. Books and films that criticized the regime were banned, and public expression of dissent became dangerous. Citizens learned to self-censor, avoiding controversial topics in conversation, art, and writing. Universities, which had been hotbeds of activism and political debate, were brought under strict oversight. Teachers and academics were monitored, and curricula emphasized loyalty, discipline, and the regime's interpretation of history. Despite these constraints, subtle forms of resistance emerged. Artists and musicians employed metaphor, symbolism, and coded messages to convey dissent. Underground publications and secret meetings preserved knowledge of Chile's political history and the ideals of democracy. Families passed down oral histories of Allende's vision, ensuring that memory and hope survived in private spaces. Even in fear, ordinary citizens found ways to express defiance and maintain a sense of agency. International reactions to Pinochet's policies were complex. Human rights organizations documented abuses, while some foreign governments condemned the repression. Others prioritized economic and strategic alliances, maintaining cooperation with the Chilean regime. International pressure, though limited in immediate effect, helped provide moral support to internal opposition and underscored the global significance of Chile's struggle. By the late 1980s, decades of repression, inequality, and resistance had left an indelible mark on Chilean society. Generations had grown up under authoritarian control, yet the ideals of Allende's vision persisted. Ordinary citizens, activists, and exiled leaders began advocating for change, documenting abuses, and mobilizing politically. The seeds of Chile's eventual return to democracy were sown during these years, nurtured by resilience, courage, and a collective memory of justice and equality. The Pinochet era also reshaped Chilean identity. Citizens learned the value of vigilance, the importance of human rights, and the need for solidarity in the face of oppression. Families, communities, and activists who endured the dictatorship emerged with a renewed commitment to democracy, civic engagement, and the protection of freedoms. These lessons would shape Chile's political culture long after the dictatorship ended. The economic reforms introduced during this period had mixed consequences. While some sectors experienced growth and modernization, social inequality deepened. Wealth concentrated among elites, and access to basic services became a challenge for the majority. These policies reinforced structural disparities, contributing to social tensions that would continue into the democratic era. Chile under Pinochet demonstrated the fragility of democratic institutions when confronted by concentrated military and economic power. It showed how fear, repression, and control could dominate society, yet it also highlighted the enduring resilience of ordinary people. Despite decades of hardship, Chileans maintained hope, resisted oppression in small but meaningful ways, and kept alive the vision of a fair and just society. The legacy of Pinochet's dictatorship is complex. On one hand, it is a story of authoritarianism, fear, and repression. On the other, it is a story of human resilience, survival, and the enduring power of ideals. The experiences of this period would inform Chile's democratic transition, shaping the country's political, social, and cultural development for generations. By the time Chile returned to democracy in the 1990s, the nation had endured nearly 2 decades of authoritarian rule. The memories of oppression, injustice, and resistance shaped public consciousness and political engagement. Citizens emerged with a renewed understanding of the value of democracy, the importance of equality, and the need for vigilance against authoritarianism. Chile's experience under Pinochet serves as both a warning and a lesson. It demonstrates the consequences of concentrated power, the vulnerability of democratic institutions, and the resilience of ordinary people. It highlights the enduring struggle for justice, equality, and freedom, a struggle that requires courage, collective action, and moral commitment. By the late 1980s, Chile bore the deep scars of nearly 2 decades under Pinochet's military dictatorship. The country had experienced profound social, political, and economic upheaval. Families who had lived under fear and oppression remembered loved ones who had been detained, tortured, or forcibly disappeared. Communities bore the physical and psychological marks of violence, surveillance, and repression. Schools, universities, workplaces, and neighborhoods had all been shaped by the constant need for caution. Even decades later, the memories of those dark years lingered, influencing the way people lived, interacted, and thought about power and authority. Despite the pervasive fear, the human spirit remained resilient. Ordinary Chileans refused to surrender to despair. Citizens, activists, and exiled leaders worked tirelessly to document human rights abuses, raise awareness, and preserve a vision of democracy. Underground movements, clandestine publications, and international advocacy slowly chipped away at the walls of authoritarian control. The persistence of hope, even in secret, demonstrated the enduring strength of collective memory and moral courage. The 1988 national plebiscite marked a pivotal moment in Chilean history. Pinochet, under both internal and external pressure, agreed to a referendum that would determine whether he could extend his rule. Millions of Chileans, despite decades of fear and repression, voted no, rejecting the continuation of the dictatorship. This act of courage and unity demonstrated the profound desire for freedom, justice, and self-determination. It was a testament to the power of ordinary citizens who had lived under oppression yet refused to let their voices be silenced. The plebiscite was not simply a political event. It was a societal reckoning. Citizens engaged in campaigns, marches, and discussions, using both traditional media and grassroots networks to mobilize awareness. Families shared experiences of loss and survival, linking personal memories to national history. Artists, writers, and musicians contributed by creating works that conveyed hope, unity, and resistance. Even in an era marked by fear, Chileans found ways to reclaim agency and demand change. Transitioning from dictatorship to democracy required careful planning and courageous leadership. Political parties that had been banned gradually re-emerged, seeking to rebuild trust and legitimacy. Leaders who had survived imprisonment, exile, or surveillance returned to participate in shaping the nation's future. Civil society organizations, human rights groups, and grassroots movements played critical roles in advocating for justice, reform, and transparency. Their work ensured that the transition was not only about restoring political institutions, but also about addressing social, economic, and human needs. Economically, Chile faced challenges as well. The neoliberal policies implemented by the Pinochet regime had stabilized certain sectors, but also exacerbated inequality. Access to education, healthcare, and social services remained uneven. Rebuilding a society torn by repression required both economic growth and social investment. The new democratic governments recognized that sustainable progress required inclusive policies that prioritized citizens over elites and created opportunities for historically marginalized communities. Chile's journey to democracy also involved confronting its past. Truth commissions and human rights investigations documented the crimes of the dictatorship, providing evidence and testimonies that would shape national memory. Families of victims, communities, and civil society organizations demanded recognition and accountability. While some perpetrators faced trials, many questions remained unresolved, leaving the nation to grapple with the tension between justice, reconciliation, and healing. Culturally, the transition period revitalized Chilean identity. Artistic expression, previously constrained by censorship, flourished. Literature, theater, music, and visual arts became platforms for exploring memory, justice, and social critique. Public spaces, previously dominated by military symbols and propaganda, were reclaimed through murals, memorials, and commemorative events. Education systems incorporated lessons about democracy, human rights, and civic responsibility, shaping the values and perspectives of a new generation. The long shadow of dictatorship affected everyday life in subtle ways. Trust between citizens was fragile, shaped by decades of surveillance and suspicion. Communities had to rebuild social cohesion, learning to navigate relationships that had been fractured by fear. Yet alongside these challenges was a remarkable resilience, a willingness to engage in dialogue, collaboration, and collective problem-solving. Chileans demonstrated that even after systemic oppression, society could regenerate through civic engagement, empathy, and shared purpose. Internationally, Chile's transition became a model for how nations could move from authoritarianism to democracy. Observers studied the interplay of political negotiation, civil society advocacy, and international support. Chile demonstrated that persistent citizen activism, combined with institutional reform and ethical leadership, could successfully dismantle an entrenched dictatorship. The lessons of this period resonated far beyond the country's borders, inspiring movements for justice and democracy in other regions of Latin America and the world. The 1990s saw Chile gradually consolidate democratic institutions while addressing the social and economic inequalities left by the dictatorship. Governments implemented reforms in education, healthcare, and housing to broaden access and equity. Electoral systems, judicial institutions, and civil services were strengthened to ensure accountability and prevent the resurgence of authoritarianism. Citizens, now active participants in governance, contributed to policymaking, community development, and social innovation. The long-term impact of Pinochet's rule continued to shape Chilean politics and society. The trauma of the dictatorship influenced political discourse, public policy, and cultural expression. Yet it also strengthened the nation's commitment to democracy, human rights, and civic engagement. Citizens learned that vigilance,
collective action, and ethical leadership are essential for protecting freedoms and ensuring that history's darkest chapters are never repeated.
Even as Chile emerged from dictatorship, the legacy of Salvador Allende continued to inspire the nation. Statues, murals, and public tributes commemorated the leader who had fought for equality, social justice, and the well-being of ordinary citizens. Schools incorporated his story into curricula, teaching children about democracy, civic responsibility, and the importance of social equity. Allende became a symbol not only of past ideals, but also of the enduring struggle for a fairer and more just society. The memory of Allende provided moral guidance for citizens navigating post-dictatorship challenges. His vision of equitable access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunity offered a benchmark for evaluating new policies and reforms. Activists, educators, and community leaders drew upon his example to advocate for social justice, economic inclusion, and democratic participation. Allende's ideals helped Chileans understand that democracy is more than a political system. It is a commitment to fairness, dignity, and shared responsibility. At the same time, the country confronted the reality of reconciliation. Chileans had to balance the desire for justice with the need for social cohesion. Truth commissions, memorials, and public discussions sought to recognize the suffering of victims, ensure accountability for perpetrators, and foster national healing. While some processes remained incomplete, the collective effort to confront the past became a cornerstone of Chilean democracy. It reinforced the principle that a society cannot move forward without acknowledging the injustices it has endured. Economic recovery and social reconstruction went hand in hand with political consolidation. Chile pursued policies aimed at inclusive growth, reducing poverty, and expanding access to social services. Efforts were made to ensure that economic opportunities were distributed more equitably, reflecting the ideals of fairness and justice championed by Allende. Civil society organizations, labor unions, and community networks played critical roles in advocating for the interests of ordinary citizens, strengthening the bonds between government and people. Culturally, the post-dictatorship era witnessed a renaissance. Artists, writers, and musicians explored themes of memory, resistance, and hope. Public art and commemorative events honored those who had suffered under the dictatorship, while simultaneously celebrating resilience and renewal. Literature and theater became vehicles for reflection, education, and dialogue, helping citizens understand the human cost of oppression and the value of democracy. Education became a central focus of the democratic transition. Schools emphasized civic engagement, critical thinking, and human rights. New generations of Chileans learned about the importance of participation, accountability, and social responsibility. This educational shift ensured that the lessons of dictatorship, resistance, and democratic recovery would be passed down, creating a society that valued informed, active citizenship. By the 2000s, Chile had rebuilt its democratic institutions while continuing to address social and economic inequalities. Citizens, inspired by the legacy of Allende and informed by the lessons of Pinochet's dictatorship, actively engaged in governance, community initiatives, and public discourse. Chile became a model for the peaceful restoration of democracy, demonstrating that even after profound oppression, societies can rebuild through resilience, ethical leadership, and civic participation. The legacy of this period teaches a universal lesson. Democracy requires vigilance, courage, and collective effort. Ordinary citizens, when guided by principles of justice, empathy, and shared responsibility, can shape the destiny of a nation. Chile's journey from hope to dictatorship and back to democracy illustrates the enduring power of ideals, the resilience of the human spirit, and the necessity of nurturing freedom and justice in every generation. Allende's vision, combined with the lessons of oppression and resistance,
left an indelible imprint on Chilean identity. Citizens learned that freedom is fragile, equality is hard-won, and justice requires active engagement. Commemorations, education, and cultural memory ensure that future generations remember both the promise of democracy and the cost of its absence. In conclusion, Chile's road to democracy is a testament to human resilience, ethical leadership, and the enduring power of hope. The struggle of ordinary citizens, the sacrifices of activists, and the vision of leaders like Allende demonstrate that even in the darkest periods, a society can reclaim its principles, rebuild its institutions, and strive for justice. Chile's history reminds the world that change is possible, but it demands courage, unity, and unwavering commitment to human dignity.
Chile's story shows that courage, hope, and unity can change a nation. Stand up for justice, dream big, and believe in the power of ordinary people. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share to explore more stories that inspire, educate, and empower. History is alive. Let's learn from it together.